There was a name in that backcountry that only had to be spoken aloud for conversations to stop mid-sentence. The people of Oakhaven had this habit without even realizing it. Whenever Gabriel Drummond's name came up in conversation, shoulders would instinctively tense, eyes would dart to the side, and older hands would reflexively reach up to cross themselves. It wasn't a manufactured fear, nor was it the exaggeration of people with too much time on their hands. It was a genuine dread, built brick by brick over 10 years of whispers, of stories told in hushed tones by the hearth, of precautions taken out of prudence that, over time, became absolute truth in the minds of those who repeated them without question. No one looked Gabriel Drummond in the eye when he appeared on Main Street. No one knocked on the gate of Deep Rock Farm without their knees trembling beforehand. And when his name surfaced in a conversation about land or business, there was always someone quick to change the subject, because there was an unwritten rule in Oakhaven that everyone followed without needing to agree upon it. The less you had to do with Gabriel Drummond, the better you slept at night. Have you ever stopped to imagine the weight of waking up every day, knowing the whole world has already decided who you are, without ever giving you the chance to tell your side of the story? Have you ever thought about what it's like to live year after year as the ghost of your own life, carrying a judgment that was never truly yours, but that stuck to your skin like sap, clings to the trunk of a Douglas fir, firm, dark, and permanent? Gabriel Drummond knew exactly what that felt like. He had learned to live that way, quiet within the borders of his farm, alone in a manner that no longer felt like loneliness, but like his very nature. It was as if he had been born to exist in silence, and silence had been born for him. This happened in November of 1934, in a small logging town nestled between the mountains and the endless firs of the Oregon Cascades, where the northern wind cut deep, even in late autumn, and the morning mist took hours to release its grip on the mountains, as if it didn't want to leave. It was a land of wary people, of long memories and secrets that aged slowly, growing denser with the years, like wine kept deep in a dark cellar. A land where what had happened 10 years ago was still happening today, because in that kind of place the past didn't pass. It stayed, it persisted, it blended with the present until the two became indistinguishable. And it was exactly in this land, in that cold autumn of 1934, that Beatrice Foster arrived by train from San Francisco, carrying a brown leather suitcase, a trunk full of books and notebooks, and an innocence that wasn't foolishness. It was simply the natural state of someone who had never heard the name Gabriel Drummond in her life. She had never heard it, had never been warned, had never been taught to fear a name before meeting the person behind it. And that absence, that blank slate she carried regarding that man, was going to change things in a way that neither she nor he could have ever foreseen back then. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you are watching this story from. It's always such an enormous joy to see that we have people from so many different corners of the world here with us. If you've been following the Tales of Yesteryear channel for a while now, thank you so much for being here truly. And if you've just arrived, welcome to the channel. Please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale. Here, we share stories of love, resilience, and emotion that stay tucked away in your heart. And now, let's get back to Beatrice, because what's going to happen to her will leave your heart full for a long, long time. Beatrice was 27 years old and had a history she carried carefully, like someone holding a fragile object in their pocket, always conscious of its weight, always keeping her eyes low so as not to stumble. She had grown up in San Francisco in a family of teachers. Her father taught mathematics at a public high school downtown. Her mother ran a small sewing and embroidery circle out of their home, where women of all ages went to learn the right stitch, the right tension of the thread, the right patience to redo it when they made a mistake. Beatrice grew up among rulers and needles, between maps on the wall and fabrics on the table, and she absorbed from both. From her father, precision and the need to understand the logic beneath things. From her mother, patience and the conviction that what seems irreparably broken often just needs to be remade with a little more care. She had a habit, since she was young, of writing things down in a hardcover notebook she always carried in her purse. It wasn't exactly a diary. It didn't have the dramatic confessions of the sort written while staring into a candle's flame. It was a collection of impressions. First impressions of places she visited, of situations that caught her eye, and especially of people. There was something she discovered early on, that the first impression of a person, before any conversation, before any context provided by others, was frequently the most honest. It was the moment when a human being hadn't yet had the time to build a pose, to adjust their mask for the observer. It was the moment you saw what was really there. At 24, Beatrice was engaged to Richard Miller, a young accountant she genuinely cared for, with the kind of affection that is more solid than passionate, but which possesses a durability that pure passion rarely achieves. Richard was good and kind, laughed easily and often, and had a habit of bringing her flowers from his mother's garden every Friday without fail, even on rainy days or days when work had been exhausting. It was a small, beautiful consistency, the kind you only fully appreciate when it's gone. They were going to be married in September of 1932. Richard died in March of 1931 of typhoid fever. It was a 4-day illness. Too fast for Beatrice to understand what was happening, too fast for her to prepare for the aftermath. One day he had a fever and a cough, and she thought it was the flu. 4 days later, he was gone, in a way that medicine at the time still struggled to combat when it hit hard. She didn't collapse into a bed of despair. She didn't go days without eating. She didn't stop working. That wasn't Beatrice's way. She was the type who stayed on her feet, but became hollowed out inside, like a house that still has its walls, but has lost its roof. She kept tutoring her students, kept fulfilling her commitments, kept writing things in her notebook. On the outside, she functioned. On the inside, there was a space she didn't quite know what to do with, one that just stayed there, present, reminding her that it had once been full, and now it was not. In August of 1934, a notice from the Oregon Board of Education reached her father's hands through a colleague who knew someone who knew the regional director. They needed teachers for rural schools in the mountainous region of the state. The post was in Oak Haven, a small logging town hundreds of miles away from San Francisco. The salary was modest, but it came with provided housing and a guaranteed 2-year contract. Beatrice's mother thought it was absurd when she said she was going. She said it was too far, too rural, that she didn't know a soul there, that it was sheer madness to trade the life she had for such a massive unknown. Her father looked at her for a long time without saying anything. That specific fatherly look that needs no words because he has lived long enough to understand what lies beneath what a person is saying, and then simply said he understood. Beatrice closed her trunk, packed her brown leather suitcase, and bought a train ticket to a land she couldn't even properly locate on a map. She wasn't running away, she told herself. She was starting over. There was a difference between the two. She believed that, or she needed to believe it, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. The train journey took almost 2 full days, with a layover in Portland that ate up a good part of an afternoon while she waited on the platform with a cup of tea that went cold faster than she expected, thanks to the biting wind of the Pacific Northwest. Beatrice spent most of the trip looking out the window with an attention that was almost professional, as if studying the landscape for a test she would soon have to give. The golden valleys of California slowly gave way to the rugged terrain of the north, the earth darkening, becoming richer, denser, and by the time the train crossed deep into Oregon, it was another world entirely. The Douglas firs appeared first in small, scattered groups along the hillsides, trees that bore a completely different posture than anything she had seen in San Francisco, tall and straight as columns up to a certain height, then opening into sweeping canopies that looked as if they had been placed there by a very careful hand. They grew more numerous, denser, and as the train climbed through the mountain passes, the pine forests spread across the ridges in every direction like a woodland in no hurry to end. The air that slipped through the crack in the window was different from California's air. It was colder, cleaner, carrying a scent of resin and damp earth that Beatrice couldn't quite name, but that somehow felt honest to her, like the smell of things that are exactly what they appear to be. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and stored that scent in her memory as a marker of her arrival. The town of Oakhaven didn't have its own train station. The closest stop was Oak Creek, some 11 miles away. A man named Bennett, who transported parcels and passengers between the two towns with an old wagon and 2 patient, tired horses, was waiting for her on the platform. He held a piece of cardboard with her name written on it in crooked pencil letters, the handwriting of someone who didn't write much, but possessed the earnestness of a man doing exactly what had been asked of him. The wagon ride took almost 2 hours along a dirt road that cut through the timberlines. Bennett spoke little, replying with a grunt or two when she asked a question, and Beatrice soon fell silent as well, letting the landscape simply happen. The road rose and dipped along the slopes in those winding curves that backcountry roads take, when no one bothered to draw a straight line, because a straight line would lead right off a cliff. Dark, wooden houses appeared here and there, set far apart from one another, with smoke billowing from their chimneys, and occasionally a figure at the window watching the wagon pass, with the quiet curiosity of someone who lives in a place where not much passes by. There was a beauty there that was rigorous, almost harsh, completely lacking the soft warmth of the California coast. It was beautiful in a different way, Beatrice thought. It was beautiful the way things are beautiful when they don't care about pleasing anyone, existing solely for what they are and not for what they seem. They arrived in Oakhaven in the late afternoon, when the light was already golden and low, bathing that first glimpse of the town in an almost unreal amber quality. The town had a main dirt road, a small white-painted wooden church with a simple cross on top, a general store with a wide front porch hosting 2 wooden benches, a hardware store with tools hanging on the outside wall, Alden's barber shop with a leather chair visible through the half-open door, and Mrs. Bates' boarding house marked by a hand-painted wooden sign with blue lettering. Mrs. Cora Bates was 62 years old and had the demeanor of someone who has seen it all and no longer needs to be surprised by anything, which didn't mean she had stopped observing. Quite the opposite. She was a woman of average height with entirely white hair pulled back into a firm, secure bun that seemed immovable even when the wind tried its best. She wore a blue and white checkered apron that seemed as much a part of her as her own skin, and possessed a pair of dark brown eyes that measured people with an efficiency that made long introductions unnecessary. She opened the boarding house door before Beatrice even knocked, which made the young teacher take an involuntary step back in surprise. Mrs. Bates announced she had been waiting since 4 in the afternoon, and that Bennett was as slow as molasses when no one at his destination was complaining. She ushered her inside with a gesture that tolerated no hesitation, took the brown leather suitcase from her hand with a strength surprising for her apparent age, and guided Beatrice through a wooden entryway that smelled of floor wax and chicken stew. A large pot was boiling on the cast-iron stove in the kitchen, and its aroma reached every corner of the house before you even stepped foot in it. The boarding house had 4 bedrooms upstairs, a dining room with 2 dark pine tables, a large kitchen with tin shelves reaching the ceiling, and a back porch overlooking a yard where an old oak tree's roots pushed up the surrounding stones. A clothesline held dish towels that swayed lazily in the wind. Beatrice's room was the second on the left at the top of the stairs. A wooden window overlooking Main Street, an iron bed with a burgundy and cream patchwork quilt, each square of fabric holding a different story she would never know but could imagine. A small desk with a kerosene lamp and a drawer that creaked when opened, and a pine wardrobe that also protested when she opened it to put away her clothes, as if the whole house was still introducing itself. Simple, clean, tidy. Beatrice tossed her suitcase onto the bed and took a deep breath of the scent of old wood and sheets washed with lye soap. Mrs. Bates appeared in the doorway with a cup of chamomile tea that smelled like open fields. She stated that dinner was served at 6:30 with zero tolerance for tardiness, that the bathroom was down the hall and hot water was available from 6 to 8 in the morning. That extra blankets for the winter were in the hallway closet because an Oregon winter was no joke for someone coming from California, and that if she had any questions about the town, she was the right person to ask, not Alden, who made up half of what he knew, nor Vernon's wife, who exaggerated the other half. Beatrice thanked her, wrapping both hands around the cup and feeling the warmth spread through fingers numbed by the long journey. She asked if there was anything important she needed to know before starting at the school the next day. Mrs. Bates lingered in the doorway for a moment, just a bit too long to be casual. Then she said there was plenty, but she would parcel it out over time, as it was the kind of thing better absorbed in pieces rather than all at once. And she walked off down the stairs with the heavy, sure footsteps of someone who knows every step and every creak by heart, and doesn't need to look at the floor. Beatrice was left alone with her tea. She took a sip. It was sweet and herbal, possessing a warmth not just in temperature but in flavor, as if the herbs had stored the sunshine of the yard where they grew. She wrote in her notebook, Oakhaven, November 1934, Mrs. Bates, a woman who knows more than she's willing to say at once. Save questions for later. The school was a pale yellow wooden building located at the east end of Main Street, near the fork that led to the rural properties of the region. It had 2 reasonably sized classrooms with sash windows that always stuck in the cold, a dirt courtyard with a young oak tree in the center that didn't yet provide enough shade for the summer heat but held promise, and a water bucket with a ladle hanging from a wooden post, which someone filled every morning before 8 from the spring, located 100 yards behind the school, down a rocky path. The principal, Mrs. Prudence Gable, was a 50-year-old woman who had been teaching for 30 of them. She had a practical, no-nonsense way of handling things that Beatrice liked immediately, the way one recognizes a language they already speak. She didn't waste words on ceremony, but she wasn't curt either. She was efficient, which is different, because efficiency can be warm when it comes from a good place. She told Beatrice that the classes were mixed out of necessity, that there were students of different ages in the same room, because that was how it worked in the backcountry, that whatever she lacked in resources, she would have to make up for in creativity, and that the only thing she expected was for the teacher to be punctual and consistent, because the students traveled far and deserved to find the school running when they arrived. Beatrice said she understood that this was exactly how she had learned to work. The first few days were for mapping things out. Beatrice learned her students first by their names, then by their faces, then by the stories that slowly emerged in their essays, their comments, and the silences that sometimes said more than their answers. She learned the rhythm of the school, learned who needed more attention, who needed more of a challenge, and who simply needed consistency and patience. And she learned the town too, on her walks from the school to the boarding house, and from the boarding house to the general store, during dinners with Mrs. Bates, who was indeed the best source of information available if you knew how to ask the right questions. She learned that Alden at the barbershop knew about any matter involving the local farms, because he shaved nearly every man who passed through them. She learned that Vernon's general store operated on an informal credit system based on trust, which hadn't caused an issue in 20 years because people in that kind of place knew that trust was the only capital immune to inflation. She learned that Dr. Nelson saw patients at the pharmacy twice a week with the solemnity of a man who knows he is the only doctor for 10 miles in any direction. And she began to learn, in the subtext of dinner conversations, in Mrs. Bates' pauses in the subjects people diverted from with a specific sort of finesse, that there was something in the town larger than its daily life. A story that hadn't ended. A name no one spoke directly, but which was always somehow present, like a shadow that appears even when the light source is hidden. It was in her second week that she heard the name Gabriel Drummond for the first time. It happened at the general store on a Wednesday afternoon, while she was picking out a skein of blue yarn to knit a scarf, because the Oregon cold was proving to be different from the California cold. More persistent, drier, the kind that creeps down your neck and up your sleeves and takes its time leaving. There were two women talking near the spice rack, their backs to her, two middle-aged ladies Beatrice hadn't yet learned to name. One of them mentioned that Drummond had ridden his horse down the lower road early that morning, and it had caused an awful fuss because her own horse had bolted at the sound of hooves on the loose gravel, and she had nearly tumbled out of her wagon. The other clicked her tongue, a sound that was half disapproval and half relief, and said that was exactly why folks with good sense didn't live near the lower road. That it was the road leading to his farm, and it was best to have nothing to do with that path or anyone who travelled it. Beatrice paid attention without showing she was paying attention, a talent she had developed over years of teaching, the ability to absorb the room without altering it by her absorption. The woman had spoken the surname Drummond with a very specific caution, as if the name itself could cause harm if spoken with anything less. Beatrice didn't ask anything right then, but she wrote it down when she got home. Drummond, Farm, Lower Road. And a single note that read, "What is it about this name that makes people lower their voices?" It remained just that for a few days, a loose thread she tucked away, not yet knowing she was going to pull it. In the third week of November, on a Thursday afternoon, it rained the way it rains in the Pacific Northwest when the weather truly decides to break. Suddenly, heavily, and with virtually no warning. Beatrice was at the school grading essays on the theme she had assigned for the week. Describe a place you consider beautiful and explain why. And she had stayed late because the essays were interesting in ways she hadn't anticipated. One student had described the spring behind the school with a precision of detail that only comes from someone who has spent hours just looking at it. A girl had written about her father's bookshelf with such specific tenderness that Beatrice needed a moment before she could keep grading. The sky bruised over in less than 10 minutes with that mountain storm speed that anyone unaccustomed to it can't believe until they see it. The smell arrived first, that unmistakable scent of dry earth bracing for water, simultaneously a warning and a promise. And then the rain fell hard, hammering the school's tin roof with a roar that drowned out everything, conversations, thoughts, plans. She waited half an hour, thinking it would pass quickly. A full hour went by. The rain showed no signs of letting up. It held steady, driven by a wind that slipped through the cracks of the old windows and formed small puddles on the wooden floor beneath the sill. Mrs. Gable had left early for an appointment. The school was completely empty except for Beatrice and the sound of the downpour. At 5:30, she decided to brave it. She had a small umbrella she had bought in San Francisco for civilized city drizzles, which was about to prove radically inadequate for what was happening outside, but it was all she had. The boarding house was about a 20-minute walk along the main path. The problem was that the main path had long stretches of dirt that quickly turned to muck, and she knew she'd be slipping in deep mud if she tried to go that way in the closed leather shoes she was wearing. Alden the barber happened to pass by on the street right then, a thick tarp draped over his head and shoulders, heading somewhere with the determination of someone who has already accepted their getting soaked. He saw Beatrice in the school doorway, umbrella in hand, evaluating the situation. He shouted over the roar of the rain that the creek trail was clear, and it would be quicker if she went that way, pointing to a path that veered left from the school, between the firs, down toward the valley. Beatrice thanked him with a wave and took the trail. The first few minutes were reasonable. The trail had enough pine canopy to reduce the rain a bit, and the bed of pine needles absorbed the water much better than the dirt road. She walked carefully, trying to keep her pace without slipping on the hidden rocks. Her umbrella was still open, though it had already flipped inside out once from a strong gust, and she had wrestled it back into shape. After about 15 minutes, she realized she had lost the trail. She had passed through a wooden gate she assumed was a boundary marker along the path, but which must have actually been the start of a different road. The firs looked identical in every direction. The fog had rolled rapidly down the hillside with the rain, swallowing any landmarks that might have existed beyond 15-20 feet ahead. The light was failing fast as the heavy clouds hastened the dusk, and her umbrella had finally surrendered, flipping inside out a second time and utterly refusing to pop back. Beatrice stood still for a moment, the rain beating mercilessly against her soaked coat, and forced herself to be rational. She wasn't dangerously lost. She was inconveniently lost. The difference was important, and she insisted upon it internally. The ground sloped gently in one direction, which probably meant there was a road, or at least a clearing at the bottom. She began to descend carefully, weaving between the thick trunks of the fir trees, her feet finding exposed roots that she couldn't see but could feel. 10 minutes of descending later, she saw the walls. They were low walls made of rough stone, the kind someone had built a long time ago using rocks pulled straight from the earth, stacked with patience, without mortar, relying only on gravity and a good sense of how stones fit together. The walls traced a wide red dirt road currently half swallowed by rainwater rushing down the slope, but it was clearly a road in regular use. It led to a heavy wooden gate crowned by an iron arch bearing the intertwined letters D and R. Wrought by a blacksmith who had paid close attention to his work, the letters both curved and uncompromising. Behind the gate stood a large, solid homestead with thick masonry walls and a colonial clay tile roof darkened by time and dampness, featuring tall windows pelted by diagonal sheets of rain. To the right of the main house was a stone chimney blowing thick white smoke that the wind quickly tore apart the moment it cleared the pipe. There was light inside the house, the glow of a kerosene lamp moving slightly behind the glass of the largest window. Beatrice gripped her useless umbrella, pushed the gate which yielded with a long, firm creak, crossed the yard with her shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth, and knocked on the front door 3 times. She knocked with more firmness than she felt inside, because she had learned that when you are afraid, it is better to knock firmly than hesitantly. Hesitation only invites the other to hesitate too. There was a silence from within that lasted just long enough for her to hear the rain drumming on the porch overhang above her. Then came footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, the kind that are never in a rush, because the person making them has learned that rushing rarely changes what awaits. The door opened. Gabriel Drummond was 36 years old and had the build of a man who had spent his entire life doing the kind of work that uses the whole body, from sunup to sundown, without holding back. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, short hair that the damp air had left slightly wavy, and a few days' worth of beard that wasn't negligence, but simply the look of a man who had no one to impress by looking otherwise. The hands gripping the edge of the door were large and calloused, with an old scar on the back of his right hand that she noticed in a fraction of a second without realizing she was noticing. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the shadows of the entryway, and they possessed a specific quality she recognized immediately. One very different from what she had expected based on the fragments of gossip she had heard. They were not the eyes of a hostile man. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to be cautious, which is not the same thing. He looked at her without speaking for a moment, evaluating her with the gaze of someone unaccustomed to receiving visitors, needing a second to process what he was seeing. He saw the drenched woman, the ruined umbrella in her hand, her shoes darkened with mud, her pinned hair mostly undone by the storm. Beatrice said, with the most neutral voice she could manage, while a drop of water ran down her nose, that she apologized for the hour, that she had gotten lost in the rain walking from the school, and that she wanted to ask permission to wait out the worst of it, if it wasn't too much trouble. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked at the rain falling behind her with the obstinance of a storm in no hurry to quit. Then back to her. Then he stepped away from the door to let her in. The entryway of the farm was a large room with wide plank floors that smelled of wax and old wood, walls whitewashed to a pale yellow by time, and a heavy wooden table in the center with a long bench on either side. A pendulum clock on the wall read 5:42 with the monotonous precision of something that treats every second with equal weight. There was a corner cabinet holding dishware and a jar of honey on the bottom shelf. And in the back, on a long shelf above what looked to be the entrance to the kitchen, lay work tools, coils of wire, a folded land map with pencil marks along the creases. And in the furthest corner, partially covered by a dark cotton cloth, the unmistakable silhouette of an acoustic guitar. Gabriel pointed to the bench closest to the kitchen with a nod that was minimal but perfectly clear, and walked into the kitchen without a word. Beatrice remained standing for a moment, surveying the space around her with that sharp attention that was her way of being in any new place. The house was clean with the specific clarity of someone who lives alone, lacking the ornaments that appear when more than one person shares a space. No dried flowers in a vase, no embroidery on the tablecloth, no framed photos on the walls. It was a house meant to be used, not meant to be looked at. And there was something in that pure functionality that Beatrice found, to her own surprise, profoundly honest. She took off her soaked coat and tried to dry it at least partially, shaking the water still dripping from the sleeves over the stone step of the entryway before closing the door. Gabriel returned from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of the spot where she had sat down, kept the other in his hand, and sat at the far end of the same bench, leaving a proper distance between them. He stared out the window where the rain continued to lash the glass, saying nothing. Beatrice wrapped both hands around her cup, feeling the heat seep into fingers numbed by the cold. "Thank you," she said. "I needed this." He didn't reply. But something in the angle of his shoulders shifted slightly, an adjustment too small to be conscious, like when someone who is carrying unconscious tension relaxes a fraction without deciding to. It was only after about 30 seconds of silence that he seemed to realize what he had done. He looked down at the cup in his own hand, as if it had magically appeared there. As if the act of walking into the kitchen and pouring coffee for 2 people had happened before his brain had given the order. The coffee was black, strong, and unsweetened. Beatrice drank it without complaint. The rain hammered against the windows in an uneven rhythm, harder when the wind pushed, softer in the lulls. The pendulum clock marked every second with a regularity that, depending on what you're waiting for, is either comforting or agonizing. The fire crackled in the kitchen behind the iron door of the wood stove, and the heat rolled into the room in gentle waves, slowly drying the coat Beatrice had draped over the chair beside her. After about 10 minutes, she announced that her name was Beatrice Foster, and that she had arrived to teach at the Oakhaven School 3 weeks ago. She said it the way she said most important things, directly, without embellishment, with the lightness of someone who has nothing to hide and doesn't believe she should. Gabriel didn't offer his name. But neither did he show any discomfort at what she had said. He kept his cup in his hand, looking out the window for a moment. Then he asked, without turning toward her, where she had come from. "San Francisco," she said. "California." He made a brief sound that could have been agreement or simply the acknowledgement that she had spoken, a sound she would later learn he used when he wanted to recognize a statement without necessarily replying to it. After a silence, he asked what age group she taught. "All ages," she replied. "It's a mixed school. I have kids just learning their letters, right up to those who already know how to write but need to learn the rest." He looked at her out of the corner of his eye with an attention completely different from his evaluation at the door. It was genuine curiosity, guarded but present. He asked what the rest was. She thought for a second. Math, geography, history? How to write a letter without sounding uneducated? How to understand what a contract says before signing it? How not to get fooled by people who know more than you do? Gabriel turned his head slightly toward her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't irony. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to recognition. The way someone reacts when they hear a truth they already knew but rarely ever hear spoken out loud. They fell silent again. The rain eased by degrees, the roar on the roof softening from a tempest to a steady drizzle. By 6:30, when Beatrice stood up to look out the window, the sky had lightened to a less hostile shade of grey, with a brighter band on the horizon promising that the worst had passed. She picked up her coat, still damp but no longer dripping, and said she would be going. She thanked him for the shelter and the coffee. Gabriel stood up as well, not out of ceremony, but simply because she had stood up, with a naturalness belonging to someone who still had some instinct of hospitality buried beneath years of isolation. She went to the door, opened it, and breathed in the cold, clean air the rain had left behind, that post-storm air that smells of wet earth and damp pine needles, possessing a purity that dry air can never quite achieve. She lingered on the threshold for a moment, looking out at the farmyard where the stones gleamed with water, the firs on the hillside still dripping from their needles. She turned back to him and said that if he ever passed by the school, he was welcome to come in for a cup of coffee too. She said it casually, the way one speaks to any person of goodwill, without special weight, without calculated intent. It was simply the kind of thing Beatrice Foster said to people, because that was how she treated people. Gabriel stood in the entryway with the expression of a man entirely unaccustomed to that kind of thing, unsure of what to do with it or where to put it. He stared at her for a second that lasted a full, heavy second. Beatrice walked out through the gate, which creaked again, and took the damp red dirt road back toward town. The edges of the sky were turning violet as the hidden sun set, the fir trees forming dark silhouettes against the purple, and the muddy path glinted faintly with moisture. She didn't yet know who he was. She didn't know the name he hadn't spoken. The boarding house smelled of dinner when Beatrice arrived, chicken and dumplings with garlic-roasted green beans, a fragrance wafting from the kitchen before she even took off her shoes. She went upstairs to change clothes before presenting herself at the table, hung her damp coat on the chair by the window to dry overnight, and stood for a moment staring at her soaked shoes, leaning against the wall. There was something about that afternoon she was still processing. She couldn't say exactly what it was. She didn't yet have the right words for what she had felt. The strangeness of knocking on an unknown door in the middle of a storm and finding a man who, instead of sending her away with some plausible excuse, had opened the door and made coffee without any fuss. The comfortable silence of two people in the same room, waiting for the rain to fade without the silence ever demanding a justification. His eyes looking down at his cup as if he didn't know when he had made the gesture, and the guitar covered with the dark cloth on the shelf. She came downstairs for dinner, wearing the expression she used when she was thinking about something but didn't want to show it, which was basically her face at rest, a fact that sometimes confused people who expected thinking to be a more visible activity. Mrs. Bates served the plates with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for decades and asked, her back still turned toward the stove, if she had been stuck at the school all afternoon because of the rain. Beatrice said no, that she had gotten lost on a trail trying to take a shortcut and had ended up asking for shelter at a farm until the rain died down. Mrs. Bates stopped serving. She turned around slowly, the serving ladle still in her hand, and asked, "Which farm?" Beatrice said she didn't know the exact name, but she had seen the letters D and R on the wrought iron gate. Mrs. Bates rested the ladle on the rim of the pot with excessive care, the care of someone putting time between a piece of information and their response, so the response comes out right. She walked over to the table and sat down across from her with a precision Beatrice recognized as the manner of someone about to say something they consider highly important and who wants to ensure you are paying attention. "Deep Rock," Mrs. Bates said. "You went to Deep Rock Farm." Beatrice said that sounded right, yes. There was a pause that held much more than just silence. Mrs. Bates asked if she had seen the owner. Beatrice said yes, that he was the one who let her in, who served her coffee, and let her wait out the storm. Mrs. Bates stared at her with an expression that combined genuine concern and something harder to name, perhaps surprise. The kind of surprise felt by someone who expected one truth and was just handed another. Then she said, her voice much lower than the empty dining room required, that farm belonged to Gabriel Drummond, and that most people in Oakhaven went their whole lives without going anywhere near his gate, and the ones who did get near it certainly didn't make a habit of knocking. Beatrice sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked if the coffee was any good. Mrs. Bates blinked. "What?" she said, with the voice of someone unsure they had heard correctly. "The coffee he served," Beatrice said with the casual tone of someone asking about the weather. "I asked if it was good." "I wouldn't know," Mrs. Bates said slowly, wearing the expression of someone trying to follow a conversation that had just swerved in an entirely unexpected direction. "I've never had coffee there." Beatrice noted that it was strong, unsweetened, but very good. And then she mentioned that she had heard the name Drummond before, that she had noticed it was a name people treated with a very specific caution, and she wanted to understand why. Mrs. Bates sat quietly for a moment, evaluating. She evaluated everything before answering, employing the economy of a person who has learned that words carry weight, and that carrying too much weight at once tires a person out. And then she began to speak. 10 years ago, she said, there was a night. A night the whole town tried to forget, but never truly could. Gabriel Drummond was 26 and had just lost his father to a lung disease that dragged on for 2 years, wearing the older man down piece by piece until there was nothing left to wear. The farm was in the father's name, and probate was still pending due to the sluggishness of the county clerk's office over in Oak Creek. During that window of vulnerability, 2 men from the Stanton family, the wealthiest and most influential family in the region, along with a 3rd outsider, showed up at the farm waving documents claiming the land was theirs to settle an old debt owed by Gabriel's father. The documents were forged. That much was proven later by expert analysis at the county courthouse. But that night, the 3 men had shown up armed, and what happened inside that farmhouse was left forever to the version of the man who survived to tell it. Gabriel Drummond was the only one who survived. The inquiry lasted 6 months. The judge, after examining the evidence and the documents and hearing the available witnesses, closed the case as justifiable self-defense. Gabriel was exonerated in every legal sense the word could carry. But the father of one of the dead men, timber baron Henry Stanton, who had been the richest and most powerful man in that entire backcountry for 2 decades, never accepted the court's ruling. He spent the following years constructing a different version of the story, a version far more convenient for his grief and fueled by the immense power he had to make his version circulate. And people, Mrs. Bates said, People listen to what the most powerful man in the county says because it is much easier and much safer than questioning him. The old baron had died 2 years ago, but his son, Declan Stanton, had inherited the properties, inherited the influence, and inherited the resentment in a measure that sometimes seemed even greater than what his father had carried. And Gabriel Drummond had stayed on his farm, alone, bearing a name everyone had been using as a warning label for 10 years. Mrs. Bates finished speaking and looked at Beatrice, waiting for the reaction she always expected when telling this story to someone new. That instinctive recoil, that tightening of the shoulders, that immediate comprehension that it was best to keep one's distance. Beatrice remained silent for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and went back to her dumplings as if they had just been discussing the weather. Mrs. Bates stared at her for a very long time. Beatrice said, without lifting her eyes from her plate, that she understood the story, and there was a piece of it she needed to think about carefully. She added that the dinner was wonderful and asked if there were any dumplings left. Mrs. Bates served the extra portion in silence, wearing the expression of someone saving a thought for later. Later, up in her room, with the kerosene lamp lit and her notebook open on the small desk, Beatrice stared at the blank page for a stretch of time that wasn't indecision, but contemplation. The flame of the lamp flickered slightly from the draught seeping through the window crack, casting slow-moving shadows against the wall. Then she wrote, Gabriel Drummond, Deep Rock Farm. Eyes that seemed to have decided to just wait for the world to prove it's entirely worthless. She stopped, reread what she had written. She wrote underneath it. Served coffee without needing to. Didn't ask where I came from before letting me in. Stayed silent like someone who learned that silence is safer than words, but not like someone who has nothing to say. She closed the notebook with the soft firmness she used for things she needed to put away, but not forget. The rain had returned, a light, patient night drizzle in no hurry to end. Outside, the firs were dark silhouettes against a sky that wasn't completely black. There was a diffuse glow from a partially hidden moon that gave the yard below the look of a black and white engraving. Beatrice blew out the lamp. She lay awake with her eyes open for a while before sleeping, listening to the drizzle on the glass and the creak of the floorboards as the house contracted in the chill of the night. She was not afraid of Gabriel Drummond. That much she knew with the same absolute clarity she knew other certainties about herself. She didn't yet know what she felt instead of fear. She had no words for it yet, but it was definitively not fear. The following weeks were a time of adaptation and gradual discovery, two things that always happen simultaneously in the kind of place where learning the territory and learning the history of the territory are the exact same thing. Beatrice learned the rhythm of Oakhaven with the patience of someone learning a new language. First the sounds, then the structure, then the meaning. She learned that Vernon's general store was where the news arrived first because it was where everyone stopped first. She learned that the 10 o'clock Sunday service was a social obligation even for those whose relationship with God was more negotiated than devout. She learned that the cold of December was going to be radically different from the cold of November, and that she desperately needed a heavier wool coat than the one she had brought from California. She took Bennett's wagon to the market in Oak Creek on a Saturday and bought a dark grey coat with wooden toggles that served her for years to come, in a way no city garment ever could. She also learned the specific silences of the town. There was the normal silence of a weekend afternoon when everyone was resting. And then there was the other kind, the silence that fell in a slightly different pitch whenever Gabriel Drummond appeared. She saw him from afar for the first time a week after the rainy night. She was walking out of the general store with a parcel of textbooks she had ordered from Portland when she heard the creak of a freight wagon coming down Main Street and instinctively looked up. Gabriel was driving a wagon pulled by a bay horse, alone on the wooden bench, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, holding the reins with the effortless ease of someone who had been doing it since he was tall enough to reach the seat. What she noticed wasn't exactly him. It was what happened around him as he passed. Two men who had been chatting while leaning against the hardware store wall stopped talking and turned away. A woman sweeping her front stoop quickly stepped inside and shut her door. The stock boy from the store, who had stepped out to help Beatrice carry her parcel, took a small step backward and stood perfectly still, eyes glued to the dirt. Gabriel passed through the street as if he didn't see any of it, staring straight ahead with that expression Beatrice had recognized on the night of the storm. Not hostility, not arrogance, but the look of someone who had simply stopped. A very long time ago, expecting things to be any different than they were. He didn't see her, or if he did, he gave no indication. Beatrice followed the wagon with her eyes until it turned the corner at the end of the street and vanished behind the pines at the edge of town. Then she looked at the young stock boy beside her and asked, point blank, why everyone had acted that way. The boy looked at her with the face of someone choosing between the honest answer and the safe one. He chose the safe one, which was also the shortest. He said it was Drummond, and it was better not to ask about Drummond. Beatrice thanked him for his help with the parcel and headed toward the school. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after the night of the rain, that Beatrice returned to Deep Rock Farm. She was honest enough with herself to admit her pretext was flimsy. She had found, in the trunk of books brought from San Francisco, a 1932 almanac containing an entire chapter on Oregon land legislation, with specific references to probate documentation and the regularization of inherited lands. She had thought, the moment she flipped through it, that it might be useful to someone trying to untangle land inheritance deeds. The thought had come naturally, without her needing to force it or convince herself it was a good idea, and that naturalness felt relevant to her in a way she wasn't quite ready to fully examine. She tucked the almanac under her arm and took the lower road, this time without losing her way because she had paid close attention when Mrs. Bates casually described the route during dinner, unaware she was providing information Beatrice fully intended to use. The iron gate with the letters D and Ram appeared after about a 20-minute walk down the red dirt road between the stone walls. Before she even reached the gate, however, a man in his 50s stepped out of a side building, a tool shed adapted from an older structure. He was of average height, his skin deeply weathered by years of sun, boasting a thick, grizzled moustache and eyes that evaluated everything with the calm professionalism of a man who knows that acting in haste costs dearly. He looked at her, looked at the almanac under her arm, then looked at her again. He said she must be the new teacher. She said yes, she was Beatrice Foster. He introduced himself as Charlie Davis, though everyone just called him Charlie, and said he had been working at Deep Rock Farm for over 20 years. She asked if Gabriel was around. Charlie stood in silence for a moment that wasn't hesitation, but pure assessment. Then he said yes, he was. He had gone down to check a fence in the lower pasture but ought to be back in half an hour, and she could wait if she wanted to. Beatrice said she would wait, answering with a tranquility that wasn't rehearsed. Charlie led her to the side porch of the house, which featured 2 heavy wooden chairs with worn leather seats and a sweeping view of the firs on the hillside. On that late autumn afternoon, the trees bore the colors of nature conserving energy for the approaching winter. They sat in silence for a while. The wind moving through the pines made that sound she had noticed on the rainy night, a deep, continuous breathing that was neither a whistle nor a roar, but rather a presence, as if the forest knew she was there. Then Charlie spoke, as if continuing a conversation that had been happening solely inside his own head, noting that she was the first person in a very long time to knock on that gate of their own free will. Beatrice said she knew that. Charlie looked at her sideways. She explained that she had heard the story, the version that circulated through town, and that she wanted to understand it better. Charlie remained quiet for a longer stretch this time, staring out at the pines with the look of a man weighing heavy things. Then he asked if she was there out of curiosity or for some other reason. Beatrice thought it over with her trademark honesty. She said that in the beginning it had been curiosity, but now she thought it was the other reason, though she was still in the middle of figuring out exactly what that reason was. Charlie kept looking at the pines. Then he began to speak. If you've made it this far in the story, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever stood by someone the rest of the world told you to walk away from? Leave a like if you're enjoying it. It really helps the channel grow and lets us keep bringing these stories to you. The story Charlie told matched the external facts of Mrs. Bates' version. But what Charlie added were the details that only someone who was actually there could provide, because he lived it instead of just hearing about it. Gabriel's father, Arthur Drummond, had arrived in Oakhaven in 1895 with nothing more than a small inheritance from his grandfather and an iron determination to build something permanent. He bought the Deep Rock lands in 1901 with a loan from a bank in Portland and paid it off to the very last cent over 15 years of relentless labor, never taking a holiday. He was honest to the marrow of his bones, Charlie said. The kind of man who loses sleep over a small debt and sleeps soundly only when his ledger is clean. The kind whose handshake is worth more than any piece of paper. Gabriel had grown up on that farm. He learned to work it before he learned to read. And he learned both because Arthur insisted on education with the same fierce rigidity he applied to work and honesty. Gabriel had even gone to study in Portland for 2 years, in 1922 and 1923, before having to return, because his father fell ill and there was no one else to run the place. When Arthur died in October of 1924, Gabriel was 26, and the farm's probate was only half finished, trapped in the slow gears of the county courthouse. It was during that window of fragility that the Stantons made their move. Charlie explained that the deeds the 3 men brought that night were forged with enough skill to confuse a layman, but they hadn't stood up to the county's scrutiny when the inquiry finally examined them calmly. The problem was that on that night there was no county clerk present, only 3 armed men, and the issue they pressed was not a matter of paperwork. It was of a decidedly different nature. Charlie had arrived at the farm in the early hours of the morning purely by chance, having left a tool in the shed the afternoon before and needing it bright and early. He stumbled right into the middle of the situation. He had been forced to stay outside, unable to intervene, because one of the 3 men was standing guard near the gate. What he heard and what he found when the situation finally resolved itself, Charlie recounted this with the stark objectivity of a man who had relived that night in his memory so many times that the retelling had been stripped down to its barest bones, like a path worn smooth by constant use. He said Gabriel had tried to negotiate first. He had tried to show them the documents he had. He had tried to resolve it with words, and then a moment came when it was brutally clear that no negotiation was possible and no words were going to stop what had been set in motion. Charlie didn't offer any details beyond that, and Beatrice didn't ask him to. What he said next was what stuck with her more than anything else. He said Gabriel had never spoken about that night with anyone except the judge during the inquiry. That after his exoneration, he returned to the farm as if it were possible to just keep going, because keeping going was all there was left to do. But the world around him had decided that moving forward was far more complicated than he had assumed. In the first few years following the event, it was common to have people outside the gate shouting curses, rocks thrown against the fence in the dead of night, threatening notes nailed to the wood. Senator Stanton had money, and he had rage, and rage fueled by money has a reach that rage alone does not. Gabriel grew quiet, Charlie said. He used to be a young man who went to church, who hung around Alden's barbershop on Saturday afternoons, who played the acoustic guitar at the dances in the square. He stopped doing those things one by one, the church first, then the barbershop, then the dances, then the guitar. The guitar vanished beneath the dark cloth on the shelf, treated like an object you don't throw away because it holds value, but that you no longer look at because it hurts. He stayed on the farm. He stayed alone in a way that slowly turned into a habit, and then into his very nature. Beatrice listened with an attention so profound it was almost visible, like something possessing weight and form. After the silence that followed Charlie's conclusion, she told him she appreciated his trust in sharing it. Charlie said he told her because he figured she was going to keep coming back anyway, with or without the story, and it was better she knew exactly where she was stepping. Beatrice said she agreed. Then they heard footsteps in the yard, heavy, slow boots on damp stone. Gabriel appeared around the corner of the main shed, his hands stained with red dirt up to his wrists. His expression shifted in a tiny, barely perceptible way when he saw her sitting on the porch. He froze for a second. Beatrice said good afternoon, with the exact same tranquility she had used to thank him for the coffee on the night of the rain. Gabriel looked at Charlie. Charlie shrugged his shoulders with the lightness of a man who regrets absolutely nothing. Then he walked off toward the barn with the steady pace of someone who has done what he needed to do. Gabriel kept looking at her. Then his eyes fell on the almanac resting in her lap. She lifted the book and explained she had found a chapter in her trunk regarding land deeds in Oregon, and she thought it might be useful depending on what he needed to sort out. He stared at the almanac for a moment, wearing an expression she couldn't completely decipher, floating somewhere between recognition and deep caution. Then he said he was going to wash his hands, and that she could come inside if she wanted to. It was a form of invitation disguised as a simple observation, which was his way of inviting people. She went inside. For the next 3 Saturdays, Beatrice returned to Deep Rock Farm. It started with the almanac and the paperwork. Gabriel had a convoluted situation with a portion of the farm's documentation that he readily admitted he didn't fully grasp. There were files from the probate period still unresolved, references to statutes he couldn't interpret, clauses bogged down in legalese designed to turn simple words into a maze. Beatrice read them aloud, translated the jargon into plain English, and identified exactly what needed to be done and who it needed to be taken to. It wasn't anything she had formal training in, but she had education, and she had method, and sometimes that's all the difference requires to be made. They worked at the large table in the living room, papers spread between them, the coffee sitting in the center. Coffee he brewed automatically whenever she arrived, without either of them ever mentioning that this was simply what happened now. Gabriel listened with an attention she slowly learned to read. When he was truly following along, the posture of his shoulders would shift. He'd lean slightly forward, his eyes locked on the document with the intense concentration of a man determined not to miss a single syllable. It was a posture so discreet that most people would have missed it entirely. Beatrice noticed it on the second day. Over time, the paperwork became secondary, though neither of them declared it so. Their conversations bled into other topics: the farm, the fir trees he was thinking about replanting in an area stripped bare by a windstorm. The peculiar way Douglas firs grow compared to the trees Beatrice was used to back home. San Francisco, whenever he asked, which he did with a naturalness that increased by degrees so small they were hard to measure, like the growth of a plant you check on every day. There was one afternoon when she spent a long time staring out the window at the pines on the hillside, under that deep, dark blue December sky, and muttered almost to herself that there was a quality to the silence of that place she had never known before. Gabriel stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking up from his paper, that was just what the place did. That mountain silence wasn't the same as city silence. The city always had some noise buried beneath the quiet, a constant hum of pressure you only notice once you leave it. But here, the silence was absolute. Beatrice looked at him. He had spoken the words without realizing he was saying far more about himself than he was about the landscape. Another afternoon, he asked why she had moved to a place so incredibly far from everything she knew. She held a piece of paper in her hand for a moment. Then she said, with that direct honesty she employed when a question deserved the absolute truth, that she had lost someone 2 years prior, and she had needed a distance that was physical, not just emotional. That sometimes grief requires a new address, so you can learn to live with it without it taking up every room in the house. Gabriel remained silent. He didn't say he was sorry, he didn't ask what had happened, he didn't ask any of the obligatory questions people ask when they hear that kind of thing. He merely said after a moment, using the specific voice he reserved for things that were unequivocally true, that he understood what it meant to need physical distance. And the way he said it made Beatrice realize he wasn't just offering polite sympathy, he was recognizing an experience he knew from the inside out. They sat in silence after that for a long stretch of time that wasn't uncomfortable. The wood stove crackled with the rhythmic language of burning timber. The wind moving through the pines offered that long, continuous breath outside. The pendulum clock ticked away the seconds with a regularity that, on that particular afternoon, felt gentler than usual. It was on that afternoon that Beatrice realized there was something happening between them that didn't have a name yet. But it was happening with the gravity of real things, the kind that don't ask permission but don't force themselves upon you either. They simply exist, the way the mist exists on a winter morning in the mountains. You don't see it arrive, but when you look up, it's already there. It was a December afternoon when she left her grey wool scarf at the farm. She only noticed when she reached the boarding house, the wind biting at her neck on the walk back. She figured it must have slipped off the chair when she stood up to check some documents in the cabinet. She planned to grab it the following Saturday. But the next Monday, when she arrived at the school bright and early, the scarf was sitting neatly folded on the desk in the teacher's room. It had a small, careful knot tied at one end, the kind of knot made by someone who isn't used to folding scarves but did their absolute best to do it right. Beatrice stared at that knot for much longer than was strictly necessary, just to recognize the object. Charlie mentioned later, when the subject came up in passing, that the boss had ridden his horse near the school one morning that week. Just passing by. Purely by coincidence. Charlie said it with the face of someone reporting a dry fact, trying not to offer any interpretation, though his eyes betrayed exactly the opposite. There was a gate at the entrance to the schoolyard that had been sticking for weeks. A wooden crossbeam had slipped its joint and fell out every time someone opened it. The handyman hired to fix it had promised to come 3 times and hadn't shown up once. On a January morning, when Beatrice arrived at the school a little early, the gate was fixed. A fresh piece of pine sat in place of the old beam, bearing the fresh marks of a saw and hammer, and the hinges had been adjusted with a precision the hired carpenter likely wouldn't have possessed. Mrs. Gable mentioned that a man had come by early in the morning with a new piece of timber and his tools. He had fixed the gate without stepping inside, without saying a word to anyone, and had left before anyone else arrived. Mrs. Gable said this, wearing an expression that clearly awaited a specific reaction. Beatrice simply said it was very kind of whoever did it, and that she was grateful, before turning to organize her notebooks for the first lesson. But that Saturday, she brought to the farm not just the documents they needed to review, but a bundle wrapped in a kitchen towel and tied with string. It was a batch of cheddar biscuits she had baked at the boarding house with the permission of Mrs. Bates, who had looked at her when she asked to borrow the oven with an expression that tried very hard not to be a smile and didn't entirely succeed. Gabriel opened the bundle with his calloused hands and stared at the contents for a moment, wearing that guarded expression he kept for situations where he wasn't exactly sure how to react. He said after a beat that she didn't have to go through all that trouble. She said it was an old habit from home. She had grown up in a house where bringing cheddar biscuits was a basic social obligation. Her mother always said you never visit a house empty-handed. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't exactly a smile. It was the beginning of one, the rough sketch of one, like sunlight trying to pierce through the dense mountain fog. But it was real, and she saw it. There was one afternoon when they were both leaning over the same document on the table, and he needed to point to a specific clause buried in the middle of a long paragraph. They both leaned in at the same time, and for a fraction of a second, they were closer than usual. He pulled back first, but not immediately. There was a heartbeat of a pause before the retreat, a vibration that hung in the air after the moment passed, like the hum of a guitar string right after it stops trembling. Beatrice walked back to the boarding house that afternoon with a warmth radiating in the center of her chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the coffee. On a February afternoon, while he was staring out the window at the yard where Charlie was fixing the wagon, with no context whatsoever prompting the remark, Gabriel said that she wasn't afraid. She asked, afraid of what? Of me, he said simply. Of my name, of what people say. Everyone around here is. Beatrice looked at him for a moment with that direct gaze he already knew, but which he had never grown entirely comfortable with, because it was a gaze that didn't judge, yet didn't look away either. He had spent 10 years either being judged or being avoided, and this was entirely different from both. She said, "Not of you." Just that. 3 words. Gabriel stared at her for a stretch of time that was incredibly long for a man who rarely let his eyes linger on anyone. Then he shifted his gaze to the document on the table and said, in a voice slightly different from the one he had just used, just a fraction lower, that she would need to sign on that line, and that one over there too, for the county clerk to notarize it. Beatrice signed in both places. But those 3 words remained between them, like an object placed in the center of the room that was never going to be moved again. Declan Stanton rolled into Oakhaven on a February afternoon in a brand-new carriage pulled by 2 dappled grey horses that were far too expensive for that muddy road. He was 40 years old, his dark hair slicked back with precise care, wearing a finely tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in a logging town. He wore the expression of a man who had grown up being told he possessed rights the world had unfairly denied him, and who had built his entire identity around that perceived slight. Beatrice saw him for the first time leaning against the wall of the general store, talking to Vernon, who was attending to him with that excessive deference people use when they are terrified but need to hide it because the situation demands polite submission. She learned exactly who he was that same afternoon when Mrs. Bates walked into the boarding house, her face drawn tight, and announced before even taking off her hat that Declan Stanton had returned. Over the next few days, Declan's presence in Oakhaven changed the very air in town, not visibly, but palpably, the way the barometric pressure drops before a thunderstorm, long before the first clouds roll in. Conversations at the general store became clipped. Alden closed the barbershop early 2 afternoons in a row. Mrs. Bates cooked dinner much quieter than usual and answered Beatrice's questions with replies that were technically complete, but which abruptly ended right before touching on anything real. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that Declan appeared, leaning against the wall outside the school, just as Beatrice was leaving for the day. He tipped his hat with a courtesy that was highly calculated, the manufactured politeness of a man who has learned to use manners as a weapon when his intentions are ugly. He spoke her name, said he had heard she was the new teacher, and noted, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that he'd been informed she was frequenting Deep Rock Farm. Beatrice stopped on the walkway. She said that she was, yes, and asked if there was a problem. Declan said it wasn't exactly a problem, more of a concern. He stated it was only natural that a young woman from out of town wouldn't know the dark history of certain individuals, and that he was merely doing what any man of good sense would do by warning a lady before she went down a path that could cost her more than she bargained for. Beatrice listened to him all the way to the end, utilizing that intense attention she reserved for things that needed to be heard completely before they could be dismantled. Then she said, in a voice of absolute, undisturbed calm, that she appreciated his concern. But she already knew the history of Gabriel Drummond. She had read the 1924 court inquiry. She had examined the land deeds, and she had drawn her own conclusions based on the facts she had read. Declan stared at her with the face of a man entirely unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a manner, especially by someone he had just met. The polite veneer on his face grew thin, like varnish cracking in the cold. He said, his voice dropping several degrees, that she was very young and very brave, and that courage without experience was just a pretty word for recklessness. Beatrice said she couldn't agree more, which was exactly why she preferred to base her understanding on legal courthouse documents rather than town gossip. And since she had a class to prepare for, she would have to excuse herself. She walked down the path without looking back. Inside, her heart was beating much faster than she would have liked, but that remained a secret between her and herself. Gabriel found out about the encounter before the week was out, because Oakhaven was the exact size of town where news arrives before the sender even wants it to. Charlie had heard it from someone who had seen it happen, and when Beatrice arrived at the farm the following Saturday, Gabriel was standing on the porch. He was on his feet waiting, which was a stark departure from how he usually was when she arrived. He stood in silence for a moment after she reached the gate. Then he said, using the voice he reserved for things that cost him a great deal to say, that she shouldn't come to the farm any more. Beatrice stopped at the gate, the almanac tucked under her arm. He continued, looking at the pine trees instead of at her. He said Declan Stanton was an old problem, a problem that wasn't hers, that she had only arrived a few months ago and was building a good life in Oakhaven. She had the school, her students, a possible future in that town. Associating her name with the Drummond name was going to put all of that at risk, and she hadn't asked to be dragged into this. He said it was easier this way, that it was better this way. Beatrice let him finish. She remained silent for a moment, the kind of silence she used to organize her thoughts so she could respond in a way that was both honest and fair. Then she told him she understood his reasoning, that it was careful, protective reasoning. It was the kind of thing someone did when they wanted to shield another person. But there was one detail he was blatantly ignoring. Gabriel finally looked at her. She said he was making a decision for her. He had decided what was best for her without bothering to ask her. She was 27 years old. She had traveled hundreds of miles alone on a train to start a new life, and she was not in the habit of letting other people decide what was best for her, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. Gabriel stared at her with the expression of a man who had braced himself for a very specific reaction and had absolutely no idea what to do with the one he was currently receiving. Beatrice then added, her voice softening significantly, that she understood he was trying to protect her, and she appreciated it. But protection without permission is just well-intentioned control, and neither of them needed that. There was a long silence. The wind moved through the firs, the distant sound of the creek rushing down the slope, the pendulum clock ticking away, loud enough to hear through the half-open door. Gabriel said, after a stretch of time she couldn't properly measure, that the coffee was ready. It was his way of telling her she could come inside. She walked in. The following week brought exactly what had been slowly building. Declan Stanton circulated a rumor, using the discreet channels powerful people rely on when they don't want to leave fingerprints, that there were unresolved questions regarding the deeds to Deep Rock Farm. Any lawyer looking at the proper documents would instantly know it was a lie. But there were no lawyers in Oakhaven, and the proper documents were sitting in the drawer of Gabriel's desk. He also circulated a less discreet rumor, a deep concern regarding the new teacher who made a habit of visiting the property of a man with such a dubious reputation. It was suggested this was something the parents of her students ought to take into serious consideration. This second rumor reached Mrs. Gable by Thursday. She called Beatrice into the principal's office for a serious conversation behind a closed door. Mrs. Gable was, above all things, a profoundly just woman, which was her most important quality. She told Beatrice she had heard the whispers. She had disregarded most of them, but some parents had come to her directly with questions, and it was her obligation as principal to pass that along. She clarified she wasn't demanding Beatrice do anything, she just wanted her to know what was in the air. Beatrice said she knew. Then she looked Mrs. Gable directly in the eye and asked if she, personally, found it inappropriate for a teacher to visit the property of a legally exonerated man to help him organize his land deeds. Mrs. Gable sat in the silence of a woman weighing the absolute truth. Then she said no, personally she did not, and she added that Beatrice's work in the classroom had been completely irreproachable since her very first day. Beatrice thanked her and left. But inside, there was something brewing that was no longer the quiet, comforting warmth of the past few weeks. It was a cold determination, the kind that rises up from your boots, the kind you feel in your spine before you even fully comprehend what you're about to do with it. On the second Friday of March, Declan Stanton called a meeting at the community church on the square. It wasn't a religious gathering. It was the sort of town hall meeting summoned when someone wants to make a public spectacle of an issue while pretending they're acting purely in the public's interest. Matters of collective concern was the phrasing used. Reverend Jacobs had lent them the space with a visible reluctance he had tried to mask, without total success. Nearly the entire town showed up. Oakhaven was exactly the size of town where not showing up to a meeting like this was a political statement in itself, and most people preferred not to make a statement until they knew which side was the safest. Gabriel didn't go. It was expected. This was exactly the kind of trap he had learned over 10 agonizing years never to step into, rooms where the narrative had already been decided before the doors even opened, where his side of the story wasn't on the program. Beatrice went. She sat near the aisle with her notebook in her lap because that was how she occupied any space where important things were happening. Declan Stanton spoke for about 20 minutes with the slick confidence of a man who had rehearsed his lines in a mirror. He spoke about land disputes in the region, about documents he claimed to have had expertly reviewed that cast severe doubt on certain properties. He spoke of a festering situation that needed to be dealt with for the good of everyone, for the good of the community, he stressed. He didn't mention Gabriel's name explicitly for a very long time, which is universally the most effective way to make a room think about someone non-stop. Then he mentioned, with a perfectly calibrated tone of faux concern, that it was only natural for a community to expect its public servants, especially those entrusted with its children, to be highly selective in their associations for the well-being of those who depended on them. A low murmur rippled through the pews like an electric current. Beatrice slowly closed her notebook. She did it with a deliberate care that wasn't overly dramatic, but which no one who knew her well would ever mistake for hesitation. She stood up. There is a very specific kind of silence that falls over a room when someone stands up at a moment when absolutely no one expects them to. That was the silence that descended upon the little church. Reverend Jacobs, after a split second of assessment, announced that she had the floor. Beatrice spoke. Her voice didn't need immense volume to carry, because there was a quality to it that simply made people want to listen. She said she had arrived in Oakhaven in November of the previous year, and she had found a good community and a beautiful expanse of land. But she had also found a story the town had been dragging around for 10 years as if it were their own, when in reality it belonged to a single man and had been twisted by others until it was utterly unrecognizable. She announced that she had read the 1924 inquiry, not the rumor, the actual court document. She had read the forensic reports, the witness testimonies collected by the judge, the final ruling. And she had also examined the original purchase deeds for Deep Rock Farm, which clearly demonstrated that the land had been bought and fully paid for by the late Arthur Drummond in 1901, without a single lingering debt of any kind. Declan interrupted her, his voice tight with forced control, stating that there were newer documents suggesting unresolved questions. Beatrice smiled thinly. She said it would be fascinating to see those documents, that she would love to examine them alongside anyone else who wished to do so, and if there was a shred of legitimacy to them, they absolutely deserved to be taken to the Oak Creek County Clerk for the verification any legal document required. She said this with the chilling calm of a poker player who has already checked everyone's cards and knows exactly what is on the table. The silence in the church shifted its weight. She kept going. She said there were people sitting in that very room who had known Gabriel Drummond long before 1924. People who were perhaps his neighbors. People who might remember that the young man who used to play the acoustic guitar at the summer dances, the boy who abandoned his studies in Portland to come home and care for his dying father, was the exact same man who now walked down Main Street while everyone stared at the dirt. She pointed out that there was a massive difference between believing a story because it is true and believing a story because it is safer than questioning the man telling it. She said she wasn't judging anyone for that. She understood how terrifying it was to stand against the most powerful man in the county when you lived there and had a family and a livelihood to protect. But she also said that a moment comes when the truth must be spoken for exactly what it is, and 10 years was more than enough time for that moment to arrive. She sat back down. The ensuing silence was the heavy, suffocating kind. Declan Stanton stood at the front of the room, his face stripped of the arrogant control he had wielded at the start of the meeting. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and failed to form a coherent sentence. Alden the barber stood up from a bench near the wall. He said, his voice a little hoarse from an emotion he clearly hadn't anticipated feeling, that he had known Arthur Drummond personally, that he was a man of his word like very few others, and that he, Alden, had always known in his gut that there was something crooked about that story, but he had never known where to put that feeling. Vernon's wife stood up next, then Dr. Nelson, then a few others of different ages and standing, people who had stayed quiet for a decade because doing otherwise hadn't seemed safe. Now, with someone standing up and saying aloud what they had all buried deep down, they suddenly found the space to speak too. It wasn't a dramatic, sweeping reversal, because real life rarely offers those. It wasn't the magical moment where everything is perfectly resolved. But it was the kind of moment that years later, when you look back, you can pinpoint as the exact second the scales tipped. The moment the story began to be rewritten from the inside out by the very community that had carried the burden of the lie. Declan Stanton walked out the side door before the meeting was even officially adjourned. He left without a word, leaving his hat on the pew. He came back for it a few minutes later, his stride stripped entirely of the calculated swagger he had walked in with. The two dappled grey horses pulled the fine carriage out of town the very next morning. Declan never returned. Beatrice didn't go to the farm immediately after the meeting. She waited 2 days, not out of strategy, but because there were things she herself needed to sit with and process. The meeting had stirred things inside her that demanded time to settle. Over the next 2 days, Oak Haven felt different, a small difference, but a real one. Dr. Nelson greeted her on the street with a nod that carried much more substance than his previous ones. Vernon's wife stopped to chat on the porch of the general store about her recipe for winter broth, a 10-minute conversation that was ostensibly about soup, but which harbored a deeper, silent conversation about profound respect. Alden passed by on the sidewalk and tipped his hat with a firm "good afternoon" that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Bates sat in silence for a long time after dinner, her knitting resting idly in her lap. Then she said, without lifting her eyes, that she had been an accomplice to an injustice for years. She said she had repeated the story exactly as it was handed to her because it was easier than questioning it. And she confessed that it had stopped being easy to swallow the moment she saw Beatrice walk out the door to knock on that gate on the night of the storm, entirely unaware of the weight of what she was doing. Beatrice told her that Mrs. Bates had done the best she could with what she knew at the time she knew it. Mrs. Bates lifted her eyes from the yarn with an expression that was simultaneously relieved and deeply ashamed. She noted that it was a very gracious response from someone who had been the subject of vicious gossip by half the town just the month prior. Beatrice smiled gently. "I'm a teacher," she said. "Grace is part of the job description." On Monday afternoon, she walked up the road to Deep Rock Farm. Charlie was in the shed when she arrived. He greeted her with a nod that compressed at least a decade's worth of gratitude he had no idea how to put into words. He told her the boss was in the main house. Gabriel was standing in the living room when she walked in, near the window overlooking the yard. His hands were clasped behind his back, staring outside, with the posture of a man wrestling with a thought he can't shake loose. He turned when he heard her footsteps. He stared at her for a moment without saying a word. Beatrice stood near the doorway, letting the silence take up exactly as much space as it needed. Gabriel spoke. His voice carried a specific heaviness, like wool soaked in water. He said he had heard what she did at the meeting. She said she figured he would. He said he hadn't asked her to do that. She said she knew that too. Silence fell between them again. He turned back to look out the window. She stayed right where she was, unhurried, because she had learned by now that with Gabriel, silence wasn't an absence. It was processing. Then he said, still facing the glass, that it had been 20 years since anyone had spoken out loud in public what she had said. Not necessarily defending him as a man, he clarified, but speaking the absolute truth about what happened that night. Relying on the documents instead of the rumor. 20 years. His voice, as he said it, carried a quality she recognized. It wasn't bitterness. It was the genuine shock of someone who had simply given up expecting it to ever happen. She said with that direct gentleness that was so uniquely hers that it had been far too long. He turned to face her. The look in his eyes was something she had never seen in all the months she had been coming there. It wasn't any specific emotion she could put a name to. It was more like an absence of something that had always been there. The permanent guard he wore as armor had dropped. It was like watching a man finally set down a crushing weight, seeing the exact moment his muscles realize they can relax. He said, with a strained effort she could hear beneath the timbre of his voice, that he didn't know how to thank her. She said he didn't need to thank her for anything. He said he did, that there were things that desperately needed to be said. She smiled softly. "Then make the coffee." And the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't the rough sketch of a smile from the afternoon with the biscuits. It went far beyond a sketch this time. It was a complete, genuine smile, small and contained, because that was his way with everything, but incredibly real. It reached his eyes, illuminating a face that had learned to be severe in so many different ways. It was the first time she had seen a full smile on him, and she locked it away in her memory, the way one guards something precious and rare. Beatrice felt something settle deep inside her chest, like a book finding its exact perfect slot on a shelf after leaning sideways for far too long. The coffee was served on the porch this time. It was a crisp March afternoon, graced by a rare sun the kind the Pacific Northwest offers sparingly enough that every appearance is deeply appreciated. The light had that late afternoon golden hue that makes everything look slightly more significant than it would under regular light. The firs on the hillside cast long shadows, signaling the day's retreat, and the air was cold but perfectly still, devoid of the wind that usually haunted that hour. They sat on the porch with their cups, gazing out at the pines, sharing the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled because it is already full. Beatrice was watching a hawk circle the ridge in slow, lazy loops when she mentioned, with the casual tone of someone merely narrating the scenery, that she had noticed the acoustic guitar since the very first time she stepped into his house. Gabriel went still. That specific stillness of a man who has heard something and is calculating what to do with it. She didn't press him. She just watched the hawk climb higher until it vanished behind the canopy of the pines. Gabriel said after a long pause that he had stopped playing 10 years ago. She said she knew. He stared down at his cup and asked how she knew. She said Charlie had mentioned it. Not the details, just that there was a time when he used to play. And then he stopped. The silence that followed possessed a different texture than the other silences of that afternoon. It was denser, hovering closer to something that had yet to be spoken. Then he stood up, walked into the house, and returned holding the guitar. There was no grand ceremony in the gesture, no theatricality. He simply went to get it and came back, like a man fetching a coat he had long forgotten and finally deciding to wear it. He sat back down and rested the instrument across his lap for a moment. His fingers hovered over the strings without touching them, like someone greeting an object he once knew intimately, checking internally to see if he still recognized it. Beatrice didn't say a word. She sat in silence, looking out at the firs, letting the space be exactly what it needed to be. The first chords were low and cautious, exploratory, like the footsteps of a man walking a familiar path in pitch darkness, checking to make sure the ground is exactly where he left it. There were imperfections, notes that didn't land perfectly, hesitations where there should have been fluid motion. But beneath it all, there was something undeniably real, the muscle memory of someone who had loved this before he was forced to stop. The knowledge a pair of hands retains, no matter how long the owner refuses to use them. Beatrice listened with her eyes on the pines, her cup forgotten in her hand, the coffee growing cold because she had stopped drinking without even noticing. He played for perhaps 10 minutes. He stopped gradually, the way a tide rolls out, not all at once. He sat in silence with the guitar in his lap, staring down at the strings. She said, without turning her head, that it was beautiful. He said he was incredibly rusty. She said it wasn't about being rusty or not. Gabriel stayed quiet. Then he said, his voice so low it sounded like a thought accidentally spoken aloud, that he had forgotten what it felt like. She turned her head slightly to look at him. There was an expression on his face. In that moment she had learned to read over the months, but this time it held a brand new layer. It wasn't sadness. It was the look of a man who has just found something he didn't realize he was desperately missing until it was back in his hands. Beatrice said, with the raw honesty that was the most defining thing about her, that it was a blessing he hadn't forgotten completely. That the music inside a person is kept in a place where the hardest, ugliest things can never reach it. Gabriel looked at her. She had turned back to the pines, showing him the profile he had come to recognize as the face she wore when she was feeling far more than she was willing to display. He spoke her name. Beatrice. She turned to face him. He stared at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who has something vital to say and is gathering a courage vastly different from physical bravery. It was the courage to let himself be truly seen. He told her that when she had knocked on his door on the night of the rain, he had stood on the inside for a long moment, listening to those 3 knocks, thinking that no matter what it was, it would be infinitely easier not to open it. That he always had that option, the option to keep the door shut, and he had used that option for 10 years against every single thing that had knocked. Beatrice listened without interrupting. He said he opened it because there was something in those 3 knocks that sounded completely different from anything he had heard hit that door in years. It wasn't the knock of someone trying to intimidate. It wasn't an angry knock. It was the knock of someone who genuinely expected the door to open. No trap, no calculation, just an honest request. He said he hadn't heard anyone knock on his door like that in a decade. He said that later, when he had brewed the coffee without even thinking, he found himself staring at a cup in the hands of a person he hadn't invited, who hadn't run away in terror. He had tried to understand what inside him had shifted to make him perform such an automatic gesture of care. He hadn't been able to explain it, but he had felt the shift long before he understood what it was. Beatrice sat in silence for a moment after he finished. Then she said, her voice quieter than its usual cadence, that she had left that afternoon carrying something she couldn't name, that she had walked back to the boarding house with something blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with the hot coffee or the cold rain. She said she had written about it in her notebook that very night, because that was her way of understanding what she felt before she even knew she was feeling it. Gabriel asked what she had written. She said she would show him later, but there was something she needed to say first. She told him she had returned to the farm that first time with an almanac under her arm and a perfectly reasonable excuse. And it was true, the almanac was useful. But the real reason was him. The real reason was that feeling left over from the rainy afternoon that refused to go away. She had returned every time after that for the exact same reason. And she had stood her ground through all the complications that followed for the exact same reason. She said she wasn't making promises she couldn't keep because she wasn't the type to throw around empty words. But she was here, right now, and she wanted to stay. Gabriel set the guitar aside with the profound care reserved for things of immense value, slowly, deliberately. Then he said, his voice carrying the weight of 10 years of forced silence, and something entirely new breaking through that silence, like a sapling growing slowly but growing to last, that she was welcome, that she had been welcome since that rainy night. He just hadn't known how to say it. And maybe he still didn't know how to say it perfectly, but he was learning. And the distance between those 2 chairs on the porch shrank in a way that wasn't rushed, because it didn't need to be. With the careful grace of 2 people who know that things worth having deserve the time they ask for. There was something Beatrice had kept tucked in her hardcover notebook since that November night, something she had considered showing him a few times without ever finding the exact right moment. On an April afternoon, when the 2 of them were resting in that comfortable familiarity of people who no longer need to explain themselves to share a room, she pulled the notebook from her bag and opened it to a specific page. She told him she had a habit of writing down first impressions of people, an old habit, likely born from being a teacher, the need to record in order to understand before trying to interpret. Gabriel eyed the notebook with the cautious expression he reserved for new things. She read aloud what she had written the night after they first met. Gabriel Drummond, Deep Rock Farm. Eyes that seemed to have decided to just wait for the world to prove it's entirely worthless. She paused, let the silence take a breath, then she read the bottom part. Served coffee without needing to. Didn't ask where I came from before letting me in. Stayed silent like someone who learned that silence is safer than words, but not like someone who has nothing to say. She closed the notebook. Gabriel sat in total silence for a very long time. An expression washed over his face that Beatrice recognized as the look of a man hearing a description of himself far more accurate than he ever expected. A description delving deeper than he thought any outsider could ever reach. He was processing what it meant to have been seen so clearly. He said, after a long while, that it was far more than he expected anyone could see that night. She said it was exactly what was there to be seen. He stared at her with the deep attention that had become completely mutual over the months, the kind of look that from either side no longer required a justification. He said her name again, in that specific tone he used when there was something he desperately wanted her to understand, before the words even arrived. She said, "I know." And it was true. She did. Autumn yielded to winter with the specific slowness of the Pacific Northwest mountains, by degrees so gradual that when the true biting cold finally arrived in December of the following year, Beatrice had already learned to recognize it at every stage of its approach. She had also learned that there was a breathtaking beauty to a mountain winter that no other season could match. The landscape of fir trees, heavy with frost in the mornings. The bed of dark, damp needles that muffled footsteps. The smoke from the chimneys rising thick and white against the frozen air. The afternoons on the porch shifted to evenings by the wood stove as the cold settled in, but they continued, which was the only thing that mattered. Gabriel began returning to the world by degrees, the exact same way he had withdrawn, one piece at a time, slowly, without any grand announcements. He appeared on Main Street on days that weren't strictly for necessary supplies. He returned Alden's wave with a nod that took a long time to materialize, but when it did, it was real. He accepted the conversation Dr. Nelson initiated about a boundary fence issue they had left unresolved for 5 years, settling in 15 minutes what had lingered purely out of a mutual unwillingness to cross the distance. The guitar emerged from beneath the dark cloth. First, only on afternoons at the farm, with Beatrice on the porch. Then, when the summer barn dance arrived the following June in the town square, someone mentioned they hadn't secured a musician. Gabriel showed up with the guitar under his arm without anyone explicitly asking him to, without any prior warning. The square shifted for a moment when the townsfolk realized who was standing there with an instrument. But the music didn't wait for people to decide how to react. The guitar began, and the notes filled the air of the square with that specific sound an acoustic guitar carries into a country summer night. Warm and ancient, reaching you before any specific memory does. The sound of something that has always been there, even if you hadn't heard it before. People stayed. They started spinning. They sang along when they knew the words. They clapped the rhythm when they didn't. Beatrice stood near the town fountain watching him. She wore the dark grey coat, with wooden toggles she had bought in Oak Creek, the cool June night wind playing with the hair she had left loose for the occasion. There was something blooming in her chest, in that exact moment that was the closest thing to pure happiness she had felt in a very long time. Not a loud, boisterous state, but a complete one. Devoid of the shadow that usually lurked beneath good things ever since she lost Richard, that persistent shadow reminding her that good things eventually end. Gabriel saw her from where he sat. Over the neck of the guitar, over the heads of the people dancing in the square, illuminated by the lanterns strung through the oak trees. He saw Beatrice by the fountain, wearing the expression he had learned to recognize, the one she wore when she was feeling something with her entire soul. Their eyes met for a moment that contained the entire journey, everything from a knocked door in the November rain to a brightly lit summer dance the following year. Everything that had transpired between the locked gate of a farm and the open square of a community, between a cup of coffee poured by accident and a song played entirely by choice. Beatrice smiled. Gabriel played. The marriage proposal didn't come with any ceremony beyond the moment itself. It arrived on an August morning in 1935, when the two of them were sitting at the large table with the farm's paperwork spread between them for the very last time. It was the final document that needed to be resolved, the final probate registry of Arthur Drummond. The name Gabriel Drummond officially inscribed as the sole owner of Deep Rock Farm, without a single pending dispute. The Oak Creek County Clerk's seal stamped in the exact right place. Gabriel stared at that piece of paper for a moment that wasn't long in seconds, but held 20 years of history within it. Then he lifted his eyes to her. He said there was something he wanted to ask. Beatrice placed her pen in its holder with her undivided attention. He said he knew she had come to Oakhaven to start over, and she had started over in ways he hadn't foreseen. But there was a part of that new beginning that had become the most important part of his entire life. He said he didn't know exactly how to explain it perfectly, but he was absolutely certain it was real. He reminded her he wasn't a man of many words, and that she knew that better than anyone. She said she knew. He asked if she wanted to stay, not stay in the town, not stay at the school, stay with him. Beatrice looked at him. The air in the room took on that specific quality of moments you know while you are living them, that you are going to remember for the rest of your life. Then she said, using the voice she reserved for the truest things she ever spoke, yes, yes, she wanted to stay. They were married in April of 1936. In a ceremony at the small church on the square that filled up in a way that surprised them both. There were many people who had stood on the wrong side for years and who desperately wanted to show somehow that they had crossed over, that they had finally understood something that took them far too long to understand. Showing up in person on that day was the most honest way they knew to say it. Reverend Jacobs performed the ceremony with an emotion he tried to suppress, without complete success. His faith carried a deep sensitivity for stories that finally work out after taking a brutally long time to do so, and he knew very few stories that had taken longer than this one. Mrs. Bates started crying at the 3-minute mark and never stopped, dabbing her eyes with the embroidered handkerchief she saved strictly for important occasions, an occasion that was now entirely justifying its use. Charlie stood near the back wall, holding his hat in his hands, wearing an expression of absolute, unbridled satisfaction he didn't even attempt to hide. The face of a man who had served a farm for 20 years, finally watching that farm receive the very thing it had been missing for far too long. The years that followed were real years. They brought real hardships and real joys, exactly as the years of a truly lived life do, unlike the fairy tales that end the moment the beautiful part finishes. There were droughts that threatened the livestock and brutal winters that tested the stone walls. There were difficult business decisions and arguments they had to learn to navigate the way two fiercely opinionated adults do, with patience and the understanding that disagreeing is not the same as opposing each other. There was the homesickness Beatrice felt for California that never completely vanished, but became bearable the way homesickness does when you build something true where you are. When the place you live becomes a place you miss whenever you leave it. And there were the good things, which were plentiful. The yard of the farm slowly filled with flowers Beatrice planted because she simply couldn't resist. Winter roses that bloomed in the cold, daisies that appeared in the spring, blue hydrangeas lining the stone wall Gabriel had rebuilt with his own 2 hands after their first winter together. The living room, once nothing but ledgers and maps, gained a bookshelf that grew slowly until it commanded the entire wall. It held volumes Beatrice ordered by mail from San Francisco, and books she found in Oak Creek, bringing them home one by one, like someone placing tiles in a mosaic without yet knowing the final picture. And the guitar. The guitar was played with more frequency, with more confidence, with the lightness that returns when a thing you loved, which was locked away out of necessity rather than choice, is finally brought back out. You realize it was waiting there, entirely intact. The things we truly love possess a resilience the things we merely like do not. The town of Oakhaven changed too, by degrees no one could have pinpointed on any specific day, but which were undeniable to anyone looking a decade later. Gabriel became a part of the community in a way he hadn't been even before he was 26. He was a different part now, more mature, built entirely by choice. The walls of suspicion were replaced by something that took longer to build, but was infinitely more solid because of the time it took. Years later, whenever someone from Oakhaven or out of town asked Beatrice what made her stay at that farm on that rainy night, when everyone had warned her it was the one place and the one person to avoid, she would say it was the coffee. The listener would laugh, assuming it was just a clever way of saying she didn't want to explain. But it was true, in a way that went far beyond the coffee itself. It was the coffee served without overthinking, without calculation, without the posture of a man with something to prove. It was the simplest gesture imaginable. Hospitality performed on pure instinct by a man who had convinced himself he had forgotten how to be hospitable, as if the habit of goodness had been stored in a place inside him that 10 years of isolation could never reach. That was the Gabriel she had seen that night, not the terrifying name, not the reputation swollen by a decade of rumors. The man who brewed coffee for a stranger knocking on his door in a storm without asking why, and who stood afterward staring at the cup in his hand as if trying to decipher his own gesture. And that was the Gabriel who remained, the one who grew, the one who returned to the world and to the music and to his neighbors with the slowness of things built to last. Because rushed things don't endure. What is good takes time, and what is true takes exactly as long as it needs to. She had stayed for that rainy night, for the strong black coffee, for the paperwork scattered across the heavy wooden table, for the guitar returning after a decade of silence, for the porch overlooking the pine trees she had learned to love, for the smile that took its time appearing, but when it finally did, reached all the way to his eyes. She had stayed for all those things, and she had stayed forever. The first winter they spent together at Deep Rock Farm was the coldest Beatrice had ever experienced in her entire life. She took it as a form of generosity from the land, which had chosen to reveal its harshest face right from the start, as if saying, "This is what I am. See if you can love me like this too." The frost arrived in December, with the specific silence of an early morning freeze. It's different from the silence of snow, different from the silence of still wind. It is a silence that settles. Beatrice woke at 5 in the morning because there was a strange brightness at the window that was neither moonlight nor dawn. She walked barefoot across the freezing floor to the glass and saw the yard completely painted white, the stones coated, the leaves of the hydrangeas bowing under the weight of the frost. The firs on the hillside, every needle encrusted in crystal, catching the meager pre-dawn light and sparkling in a way she had never witnessed before. She stood staring for a long time, her feet freezing on the wood, a coat thrown over her shoulders above her nightgown. Her breath bloomed white with every exhale, as if the cold made the invisible palpable. Gabriel appeared behind her, holding a thick wool blanket, which he draped over her shoulders without a word. He stood beside her in the window frame, staring out at the frozen yard. The two of them together, while the Oregon mountain winter outside was everything an Oregon mountain winter could possibly be. After a while, she said she had never seen anything like it. He said that at first he used to think he'd grow tired of it over the years. But he never did. Beatrice looked at the white pines and thought there were things exactly like that. Things you assume you'll grow tired of because they are too intense to last, but you never do, because they possess a beauty deep enough to reveal new layers every time you look. Like certain people, she thought. Like certain stories. She turned slightly toward him and announced she wanted to learn how to bake the sourdough bread Vernon's wife had mentioned once. The crusty kind made with lard that comes out dense and hot in a way no delicate bread ever could in the mountain cold. Gabriel looked at her for a moment. He pointed out that he didn't know how to bake bread. She said she knew that. She was the one who was going to learn, and he could help her without knowing how, because helping without knowing is entirely different from teaching. He wore the expression of a man who was still learning that conversations with Beatrice sometimes veered in directions he hadn't anticipated, but which invariably arrived somewhere that made perfect sense. He said he was going to make the coffee in the meantime. She said that was exactly what she expected him to say. The Oakhaven school grew from the inside out over the years Beatrice taught there. It didn't grow in its walls, which remained the same pale yellow wood with the sticking sash windows. It grew in its students. It grew in the bookshelves that steadily gained more volumes. It grew in the way the community began to look at that building, not as a formal obligation, but as a place that belonged to their lives in a profound, integral way. There was one student in particular, a boy named Valery Grimes. He was the son of a farming couple who lived 7 miles from the school, a distance he walked every single day, Monday through Saturday, with a consistency Beatrice identified as the mark of someone who goes very far if nobody trips them up. He was 12 when she arrived, possessing a mathematical intelligence that was rare in the truest sense of the word. Not the kind that memorizes well, but the kind that grasps the underlying structure of a concept before even learning its name. Beatrice had handwritten a letter to the State Academy in Portland, describing the boy's aptitude with the precision of a doctor writing a diagnosis, because that was exactly what she was doing. She included samples from his exercise books, showing the solutions he had engineered for problems 2 grade levels above his own. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive, and the response took another 6. But it came. And it arrived carrying a full scholarship, made possible by a rare alignment of bureaucracy, goodwill, and the simple fact that someone at the academy had recognized exactly what Beatrice had recognized in those notebooks. Valery moved to Portland in March of 1938. His mother and father came to the school to thank her on a February afternoon. His father stood there, lost for words for a stretch of time, long enough to make it crystal clear that what he had to say was vastly larger than the vocabulary he had available to say it. Gabriel heard about Valery on one of the afternoons Beatrice arrived at the farm, with her head still full of school, as happened on days when something she was still processing had occurred. He listened with the deep attention he reserved for the things she deemed important, an attention she could measure by the set of his shoulders and his unblinking focus. He sat in silence for a moment after she finished. Then he said, in a way that wasn't directly connected to her story, but connected to its very roots, that his father had once told him the most expensive thing in the backcountry wasn't the land or the cattle. It was opportunity. He said what the backcountry lacked wasn't hard work or willpower, it was opportunity. And opportunity relied entirely on someone knowing how to spot it in a person before life buried them. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. Then she said his father had been a profoundly wise man. Gabriel agreed that he had been. And he sat in a silence holding the specific grief of missing a father, a grief that never entirely leaves but changes shape over the years, becoming less sharp and more profound, less an ache of pain and more a sense of belonging. A tradition slowly formed between them without either ever officially declaring it a tradition. On the first Friday of every month, Beatrice and Gabriel went to dinner at Vernon's general store. Vernon had set up 2 tables at the far end of his porch in the spring of 1936 and started serving a simple dish of chicken and dumplings his wife cooked up, initially prompted by a traveling salesman begging for somewhere to eat besides Mrs. Bates's boarding house. It wasn't a restaurant. There was no menu, no fixed price. Generosa, Vernon's wife, cooked whatever she had on hand, and whoever ate paid whatever they believed was fair. And there was something about that system that worked flawlessly in that town, with those people, because there was enough mutual trust for the whole structure to hold. Gabriel had resisted the first time. He argued there were too many people, it was too loud, and there was absolutely no need to eat out when there was perfectly good food at the farm. Beatrice countered that the need wasn't about the food. He gave her the look of a man trying to understand and simultaneously giving up the pretense that he did. She explained it with the patience of the teacher she was. Leaving the farm together, stepping into a place where other people were, was a way of existing in the world together. Existing in the world together was different from existing together isolated on the farm. Both were necessary, and each carried its own unique weight and value. Gabriel sat in silence for a moment. Then he asked what time she wanted to leave. Generosa, who more than lived up to her name, served them on that first night with an attentiveness driven by an unspoken recognition that what was happening at that table held a weight the chicken and dumplings didn't begin to cover. She came back twice to ask if everything tasted all right, before returning a third time, merely to whisper that there was plenty more if they wanted it. Gabriel ate his chicken amidst the noise of the surrounding conversations, with Beatrice in the chair right beside him. When they got back home, he announced that the dumplings were excellent. Beatrice smiled. He asked what was funny. She said nothing was funny, she was just deeply satisfied, and she left it at that. Charlie Davis was never a man of grand gestures. He was the kind of man who kept his convictions tucked safely inside, where they took up less space and cost less to maintain than when put on display. But there was a September morning in 1936 when he walked up to find Beatrice reading on the porch with a cup of tea on the worn leather bench that he stopped with his hoe in hand and just stared for a moment. He stared long enough for her to notice and look up from her book. He said, with the raspy voice of mourning and of men who never speak more than required, that it was good to see the farm looking different. Beatrice asked different how. He thought it over for a moment, weighing his words with the careful precision he applied to everything. Then he said that a farm without people coming and going is a farm that slowly forgets itself from the inside out. The walls remain, the earth remains, the cattle remain. But something slowly slips away, a kind of amnesia that doesn't have a name, but which you instantly feel when you walk into a place that used to be bursting with life and is now only filled with function. He noted it had been like that for years, but now it was different. Beatrice stared at him with those eyes that offered the most absolute form of attention she possessed. Charlie gave a curt nod, gripped his hoe with both hands, and walked back to his work with the stride of a man who has said exactly what needed saying and requires nothing further. She sat with his words for a while before returning to her book. Later, she wrote it down in her notebook, not because she would forget it, but because that was her way of storing things that held immense weight. Charlie Davis, September 1936. A farm without people coming and going forgets itself from the inside out. It was one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard about what makes a house and what transforms a house into a home. The letter from San Francisco arrived on an October afternoon in 1937. It was from Beatrice's mother, written in the slanted, rounded cursive she had developed over 30 years of teaching embroidery, marked by the firmness of someone who holds a needle in a specific way that leaves a permanent impression on how they hold a pen. Her mother wrote that her father had retired from the high school and his health was good. The roses in the yard were blooming beautifully despite a summer heat wave that had been vastly more punishing than usual. She wrote that she had received the news of Beatrice's wedding with a fierce joy, laced with the tight ache of a mother too far away to witness a moment she desperately wanted to see with her own eyes. She said she understood, she had always understood, that her daughter was meant to go wherever life called her. It cost her deeply to have her daughter so far away, but she could bear it, because she could clearly see that her daughter was thriving. She wrote that she wanted to meet him, the man her daughter had chosen, the man her daughter had stayed for. She confessed she had lain awake many nights after receiving the letter Beatrice had sent, describing the entire saga with her trademark honesty. An honesty that hid nothing, because Beatrice never believed hiding things did anything but delay the inevitable. and she wrote that, after thinking over everything she had read, she fell asleep with the profound certainty that her daughter was in the right hands. Not because the man was perfect, Beatrice hadn't written that at all, but because the man her daughter described possessed the exact same quality her daughter did. The quality of being exactly what he is, without ornament, without a facade, bearing the raw honesty of things that don't need a golden frame to hold immense value. Beatrice read the letter twice before taking it to Gabriel. He read it once, slowly, with the intense concentration he reserved for the written word, the concentration of a man who had learned to read late enough in life that he never lost his deep reverence for the weight words carried. He held the letter in his hand for a moment after he finished. Then he said he would like to meet her. Beatrice said her mother was going to adore him. He gave her the slightly skeptical look he utilized whenever someone said something he found far too generous to be entirely true. She insisted she wasn't just being polite, she was being perfectly precise. Her mother was the exact same breed of person she was. She saw clearly, without judging. She stayed where there was a reason to stay, and walked away from where there wasn't. And there was plenty of reason to stay near Gabriel Drummond, just like there are things you don't need to explain because the evidence speaks entirely for itself. Gabriel folded the letter with the same reverence he had used to read it and handed it back to her. He announced he was going to clear out the guest room in the East Wing, which had been functioning as a storage closet for far too long. She told him that was exactly what she expected him to say. Beatrice's parents arrived in February of 1938, surviving a brutal 2-day train journey that her father endured without complaining even once. A truly staggering feat, given that her father complained about trains with the stubborn regularity of a man who had formed a bitter opinion on the subject decades ago. Her mother arrived hauling a suitcase that contained, among other things, 4 pounds of sharp cheddar cheese, wrapped tightly in clean cloth and tied with string. She held the ironclad conviction that if you travel a great distance to visit someone, you bring good cheese. That conviction yielded neither to the absurd weight of the suitcase nor the sheer distance of the journey. Her father shook Gabriel's hand with the firm grip of a veteran teacher, evaluating him over the rims of his round spectacles with the calm, measured assessment of a man who has spent a lifetime observing what stands in front of him before forming an opinion. Then he noted the farm was quite large, and he admired the stone walls. Gabriel said the walls were built by his grandfather, who had traveled up to Oregon from California. Her father replied that it was a fine origin story for a wall, and that good work done with strong arms preserves the memory of the arms that built it. Gabriel stared at Beatrice's father for a moment, with an expression she recognized as the look of a man hearing someone articulate a thought he himself had felt, but never managed to put into words. Her mother gifted Generosa at the general store 2 pounds of the cheddar cheese as a courtesy. She had deduced, with the terrifying accuracy of someone who can read a room with virtually no data, that Generosa was the type of woman who appreciated good cheese vastly more than fresh flowers. She was completely right. The 2 weeks they spent at the farm were weeks the house absorbed in a way Beatrice only fully realized after they left. The house built for 2 stretched for that fortnight to hold 4, and there was something in that expansion that felt completely different from a simple addition. It was like planting something in a garden and watching it grow far larger than the original space seemed to allow, only to realize the space was actually much bigger than it looked because the foundation beneath the soil was far deeper than you had calculated. Her father played games of dominoes with Charlie on the porch in the afternoons, dominoes that had miraculously appeared from somewhere no one could accurately trace. The matches were played with the grave, playful seriousness mature men apply to simple games when they want to share time together without having to talk about feelings. Her mother taught Generosa her recipe for the cheddar biscuits Beatrice had learned at the boarding house. Generosa, in turn, taught her mother the secret to the navy bean and bacon soup that was the crown jewel of the store's menu. Both women walked away from the exchange with the fierce, specific satisfaction of women recognizing each other as members of the exact same tribe. On the final night before their journey back, her father sat on the porch with Gabriel long after the others had gone to bed. They sat in silence in the February chill, a cold that was decidedly the cold of the Pacific Northwest, infinitely sharper than San Francisco's winters. Carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth that her father had learned over the 2 weeks was the definitive smell of that land. Her father said his daughter was doing well. Gabriel said he tried his best. Her father sat in silence for a moment. Then he noted there was a vast difference between men who try because it is expected of them, and men who try because they literally cannot stop themselves from trying. He added that he had observed Gabriel was firmly in the second category, which was the most profoundly reassuring piece of information a father could ever learn about the man taking care of his daughter. Gabriel said nothing for a long time. Then he admitted that her father's daughter was the kind of person who had walked into his life through the wrong door, through the door of a Thursday night rainstorm. But she had come through the honest entrance. Without warning, without a grand facade, asking only for exactly what she needed, which was a place to wait out the storm. He said he had learned in the years following that night that the honest entrances are the ones that endure. Her father stared out at the pines for a while. Then he announced he was going to bed, as the train left early and he didn't sleep well in motion. But he walked off the porch wearing the expression of a man who had just heard the exact words he needed to finally set down a heavy burden he hadn't known where to place. There was an event in 1941 that Oakhaven celebrated in a manner far exceeding what was typical for a logging town of its size. The school was expanded, not by the county, which had promised the expansion for 4 years without translating a single promise into wood and nails. It was expanded by the community itself, which collectively decided that 4 years of waiting was enough, and that they had the muscle and the lumber to do what needed doing without waiting for a bureaucrat from the city to sign a paper. Gabriel coordinated the construction, not because anyone formally asked him to, but because it happened the way things happen in communities that have slowly learned to organize themselves. The chatter about what to do took place at the general store and the barbershop, and at a certain point, everyone simply turned and looked at Gabriel. They looked with the natural instinct of people realizing there is a man in the room with vastly more competence in timber and foundations than anyone else. Gabriel had simply said he would see what could be done. He took Charlie and 2 of his farmhands, measured the available space in the schoolyard, sketched out the framing on a plank of wood with a carpenter's pencil, and spent 3 straight weeks of Saturdays and Sundays leading a project the entire town participated in. The men swung the hammers, the women hauled water, cooked the meals, and provided the invisible scaffolding of support that never shows up in the photographs, but is the singular reason the work actually gets finished. The new wing was inaugurated on a Friday in October with a ceremony that was simple, because the town was simple. No long-winded political speeches, no unnecessary ribbons. Mrs. Gable simply announced that the school could now hold double the students it previously accommodated. That meant there were children out on the farthest logging claims who could finally attend, children who had previously stayed home simply because there hadn't been an empty chair. Beatrice stood looking at the new classroom, the autumn light pouring through the freshly paned windows. She felt that sensation she had learned to recognize over the years as the specific feeling the school gave her. It wasn't exactly pride. Pride felt too personal. It was closer to the profound satisfaction of watching something you deeply believe in exist in a far more complete way than it had the day before. She looked over at Gabriel, who was standing near the new wall, checking a door hinge with the intense scrutiny of a man who refuses to let a detail slide, even after the detail has been universally applauded by everyone else. She walked over to him and whispered, low enough that only he could hear, that it was beautiful work. He checked the final hinge. He stared at the new room for a moment, wearing the expression she had come to know as his face when things made him feel far more than he knew how to physically express. He finally said the timber was good, that properly cured Douglas fir lasts longer than almost anything else. She smiled. "I know." And she stood beside him, looking at the new room. The two of them together on the threshold of what had been built, with the golden October sun of Oregon spilling through the windows, listening to the roar of the children in the yard outside. The kids had already returned to playing with that terrifying velocity of youth, the ability to turn the extraordinary into the everyday long before the adults have even finished processing that the extraordinary just happened. Beatrice's hardcover notebook filled up over the years with the quiet regularity that defined her. Not every single day, not out of a rigid sense of duty, but whenever something occurred that demanded to be kept in a way more permanent than memory could guarantee. There were short entries and long ones. There were specific dates, and there were undated pages she had simply forgotten to mark, but which she kept anyway because the lack of a date didn't make the words any less true. There were names of students with margin notes, her way of tracking who was thriving and who was silently begging for a little more help. There were observations about the weather, about the fir trees, about the massive blizzard of 1942 that buried the world in a blinding white she spent an entire morning just staring at, unable to walk to the school, feeling it was her absolute moral responsibility to fully witness such terrible beauty. And there were entries about Gabriel. Entries that were mostly brief, because the most vital things usually fit into very few words when you stand close enough to them not to need to describe them from a distance. An entry from April of 1937 read simply, "Played the guitar for almost 2 hours this afternoon. Kept his eyes closed at the end. I think he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear." An entry from September of 1939 read, "Spoke to me today about his father. The first time he truly spoke about him, not just in passing. I keep thinking that silence isn't an absence, it's storage. We silently hoard the things that don't yet have enough room outside to breathe." An entry from December of 1940 said he was happy today. Not with those exact words, because those words don't come easily to his tongue. He said, "It was a good day." But the way he said it was the way of things that are infinitely larger than the vocabulary used to express them. And there was one undated entry near the back of the notebook, written on a page where her handwriting was slightly different than usual, less rigidly controlled. The handwriting of someone writing late at night, by a dim kerosene lamp, or someone too overwhelmed with emotion for their hand to completely obey. Sometimes I think about the night of the rain, the creaking gate, the door that could easily have remained shut. All the life that was waiting on the other side of that possibility, all this life that never would have happened if he had decided in a fraction of a second not to open it. And I'm struck by a kind of gentle vertigo, realizing how the most massive, entire parts of our lives balance on such impossibly small decisions. A gate, a door, 3 knocks in the middle of a storm. That is all it took to begin. That notebook had more pages after that entry, but they were blank. She had bought a new one. It began with an entry in January of 1943 that said simply, "Another year, another notebook. The same farm, the same pines, the same guitar on Saturday afternoons, the same certainty," which was the most unexpected thing of all. That the certainty would grow instead of shrink, that I would know more now than I did at the start, that staying would become, over time, the easiest thing I have ever done. In 1948, Beatrice marked her 14th year teaching in Oakhaven. There was a specific gravity to that milestone, one she felt keenly because she was a teacher, and teachers learn to honor the milestones their students teach them to honor. The anniversaries of things, the beginnings of phases, the closings of others. Mrs. Gable had retired in 1945. The new principal was a 35-year-old woman named Irene, who hailed from Portland. She arrived with the specific energy of someone desperate to make a difference, tempered by the humility of someone who knows that making a difference begins by deeply understanding what was there before you arrived. She sought Beatrice out in her very first week with genuine questions, not bureaucratic formalities. Beatrice answered with the brutal honesty she reserved for real questions, and over time, the two built a working relationship that seamlessly evolved into a deep friendship. Alden the barber had passed his shop down to his son, Harrison, in 1946. But he still showed up every Tuesday afternoon to sit in the worn leather chair that had been his for 30 years, just to make sure the boy was doing things right. His son did things perfectly right, but he let his father check anyway, because there was a profound wisdom in that supervision that had nothing to do with mistrust. And at 32, with a family of his own to raise, the son had learned to recognize that. Mrs. Bates passed away in 1944 after 80 fiercely lived years. She left the boarding house to her niece, Valerie, who religiously maintained the scent of floor wax and the absolute zero-tolerance policy for being late to the 6:30 dinner. The two things her aunt had made violently clear were non-negotiable. By 1948, Charlie Davis was 62 years old. He worked the farm with the rhythm of a man who has shortened his stride without ever stopping his walk. He carried the specific wisdom of someone who has learned the difference between being tired and being broken. The tired man rests and then keeps going. Knowing that difference is one of the most valuable pieces of knowledge a human body can acquire. Gabriel was 50 years old. He reached that mark with the composed severity of a man who wears much of himself on his face. The lines of a life are entirely different from the lines of time, because the lines of a life hold the stories that carved them. On his face, if you knew how to look, you could clearly read two distinct versions of the man. The man who had been utterly alone for 10 years, etched into the deeper lines of his forehead and the specific crinkle at the corners of his eyes, and the man who had been dragged out of that isolation by a teacher from San Francisco on a rainy night. That second man lived in the more open way he looked at the world, the easier arrival of his smile, and the acoustic guitar that had been played every single Friday without fail for over a decade. Beatrice was 41. She belonged to Oakhaven far more deeply than any previous version of herself could ever have predicted. She was of that earth in a way that transcends merely living there. It was the state of being molded by a place just as much as you mold it. When the smell of pine needles becomes the smell of home exactly as much as the smell of the wood stove does. When the biting, specific cold of an Oregon winter becomes your winter, not the winter of somewhere else. On the night of her 14th anniversary in the town, Gabriel cooked dinner himself. It wasn't something he did often, but he had decided to do it that night with the silent, immovable determination of a man who decides a thing must be done, and therefore it will be done. He made chicken and dumplings with garlic green beans because it was what he had learned to make well over the years. He used the exact seasoning trick Generosa had taught him in passing during a conversation that hadn't even been about cooking, proving that the best conversations yield information the way the best moments yield memories, completely by accident. They ate at the large wooden table, drinking a wine Vernon had procured from a special shipment out of Napa Valley. It was the kind of wine explicitly bottled to be opened on nights that deserved it. And after dinner, while the table still held the empty plates and the candles that had burned low during the meal, Gabriel picked up his guitar. He played for a solid hour, uninterrupted, with a fluency that had returned by slow degrees over the years and was now entirely his again. He wasn't the musician he had been at 26. He was a different musician. There was vastly more inside the notes now, because there was vastly more inside the man playing them. Beatrice listened with her hands resting on the table and her wine glass pushed slightly aside. She listened with the absolute, undivided attention she gave to things that demanded it. She stayed perfectly still until the final note settled into the cold air of the living room, accompanied only by the pendulum clock ticking away the seconds, carrying on with its mechanical indifference to the beauty of the world around it. When the guitar finally stopped, the silence that followed was the silence of after the music, a silence distinct from all others because it holds within it the memory of the beauty that just existed. Gabriel sat with the guitar in his lap, looking at her. She told him it was beautiful, that it had grown even more beautiful over the years. He said that was because there was more to put inside it now. She stared at him with that intense gaze that had never once wavered. The exact same quality of attention that had been there on the night of the rain, on the porch looking at the pines, at the meeting in the church, on their wedding night, in every single moment across all those years. The unwavering attention she bestowed upon the people she chose to truly see. And she said, her voice ringing with the truth of things that require absolutely no proof, that staying had been a very good choice. Gabriel sat for a moment that held 14 years of morning coffee, Friday night guitar sessions, frost-covered winters, farm ledgers, general store dinners, rebuilt stone walls, cheddar biscuits carried under an arm, comfortable silences, and conversations that traveled to places he had never predicted. He said that it was the best choice he had ever witnessed up close in his entire life. She laughed, a low, real laugh, the kind that starts deep in the chest. And the corner of his mouth moved too. That smile that had taken so long to arrive, but was infinitely more beautiful precisely because of the time it took. And outside, the Douglas firs were dark shadows against the ink-black Oregon winter sky. The wind passing through their branches drew that long, continuous breath, the very first sound she had learned to recognize in that land. That sound which was a presence, which was belonging, which was the sound of a place that knows you finally stayed.